Well, hello again, everybody. It's Ronelle Delmont again. Uh, I'm in Florida, and I think Kurt is now in Florida as well, and he's back again for part three of the ransom negotiations and an analysis, his analysis of the ransom notes, how they were written, why they were written, the handwriting, and all of that good stuff that you're interested in. In case you didn't see parts one and two, Kurt Tolksdorf is the son and grandson of two men who were involved in the woodworking industry and knew personally and worked alongside with Richard Hauptmann, who was a very good carpenter. We talked about that in a previous part. And Kurt, because of his family ties with Richard Hauptmann, he knew Anna Hauptmann before her death in the 90s. He spent a day with her and interviewed her. So he mentioned all of that in part two, I think it was. So here we are back at part three, and we're up to his page number 38 in his beautiful presentation of the ransom negotiations. So Kurt, take it away, and I'll move the pages as you tell me to. So we're up to the part where Condon, let me remind everyone, Condon is Dr. John Francis Condon, whose initials are JFC, otherwise known to Lindbergh Kidnapping aficionados as JFC. And he went to St. Raymond's Cemetery on April 2nd in the evening with Charles Lindbergh, who sat in a car, and Dr. Condon delivered the money to someone who was later named John, Cemetery John. And Kurt is going to explain what happened that night. Go ahead.
Yes, the amount of money that Lindbergh and Dr. Condon had on hand with them at St. Raymond's was $70,000. $50,000 of that money was packed in the box, and $20,000 was separately packed. Now, Dr. Condon went into the cemetery without Lindbergh, met Cemetery John, and whom he had met on March 12th, and convinced Cemetery John, allegedly, to accept $50,000 and instead of the full $70,000. Then Dr. Condon came back to the car, went back to the car and met Lindbergh and told him that they only needed $50,000 for the ransom. So Lindbergh kept the $20,000, and Dr. Condon carried the $50,000 back into the cemetery and handed it over the hedge to Cemetery John, and Cemetery John disappeared into the night, but not before handing over a note that described where the child was to be found, and that was the famous Botinelli note.
You want to read it?
I'm sorry?
You want to read it? The handwriting. Sure. The handwriting looks like all the other ransom notes.
Yes. And the note says, the boy is on Botinelli, B-O-A-D. It is a small boat, 28 feet long. 2 persons are on the boat. They are innocent. You will find the boat between Horseneck Beach and Gay Head near Elizabeth Island. Now, those locations are up in Vineyard Sound, east of Providence, Rhode Island, and south into the water between Martha's Vineyard and the mainland.
So maybe President Obama is the Cemetery John.
Well, yeah. How Hauptmann knew of this location is hard to fathom.
Yeah, but we know one person who knew this location very, very well. He went there.
Who was that?
We know of one person in the kidnapping scenario who knew this neighborhood very, very well. He went there on his honeymoon.
Oh, Lindbergh.
Right.
Well, I have a theory about this Botinelli note but it's not in the main line of our discussion today, so
Right,
I'll
so we'll
leave
just
it
leave it.
aside.
Right, I'm
Let's
only,
let's continue with the next slide, and we'll follow
oh,
up the train of thought.
busy. Okay, how do I move it? There we go.
And I'm reminding you that Dr. Condon convincing Cemetery John to accept the $50,000 could easily have been a device agreed upon between John and Dr. Condon in order to make the latter appear completely innocent of anything in the kidnapping itself.
Right, so you're questioning this operation that Condon pulled off alone in the cemetery with a guy who's supposedly the kidnapper, bargaining with him as if it's a bazaar, or, well, bargaining him down $20,000. You're saying that that operation was pulled off to prove that Condon was not with the kidnapping gang, that he was an
Correct.
honest broker in the deal.
Correct.
Yeah, that's, I want to make that
Correct.
clear. Okay, so 15, go ahead.
So now we look back over this experience between March 1st and April 2nd, and then we have 15 ransom notes, various kinds, over this whole period of time. And I'm asking, were they all necessary for the kidnapper to collect the ransom? Why, in other words, would the kidnapper carry on at such length, knowing that the baby's corpse was lying out in the open? It's absurd. And so finally, we ask how many notes were really needed in order to collect that ransom? Think about it.
I do. I think everybody should think about it. Whoever heard of a kidnapping with 15 notes?
Right.
Okay.
The answer is one ransom note. It could have been the nursery note, and it could have been printed in block letters instead of written in any kind of script. And it would say, no cops, no press, spell out the amount of the ransom, with the total 50,000, and the demand to have the money ready by, say, March 12th to give Lindbergh time to collect it. And then it would mention a phone booth at a certain location and give us certain times, very specific, and it will say, I will call with directions. No other ransom notes, no other carrying on, no other free associating, no other posturing of any kind, just the single ransom note. And it could have been left in the nursery, in the baby's nursery.
And isn't that interesting that it never was put in the crib and the place where you would expect a kidnapper to put such a thing?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Now, could Hauptmann print in block letters? Well, of course, he in the cabinet works where he worked, he frequently made notes on shop drawings in pencil, and he printed in block letters. They didn't write in script. And my uncle, who knew Hauptmann as his paper boy, made a point of describing this to me many years ago.
Oh, really?
Yes.
He told you because they wrote in block letters on the wood to describe what they had, where it goes, you mean?
Well, they didn't write in block letters on the wood, but they made notations on the shop drawings about
Oh,
how things would be made and what the dimensions were and so forth. But they never wrote in script in the shop.
well, that makes sense because you can't read everybody's handwriting, and block
Right,
letters are so much easier to understand. So
right.
why didn't the kidnapper do it that way? What's your answer?
Well, the answer that most people give you is that Hauptmann was just stupid. He
Stupid.
didn't think of it. But Hauptmann was also shy and taciturn. Why would he go on at such length in the ransom notes? It was completely counter to his nature. He was a shy, quiet guy.
You know, that's a great point that nobody has ever suggested. It's not this, these ransom notes are not in keeping with his personality
Of
at
course not.
all. Not at all. I mean, even Jim Fisher would have to admit that. You know, Jim Fisher, who's a fundamentalist, Hauptmann did it guy. So the fundamentalists, I call them fundamentalists because they only believe what, you know, the script from the trial, and
Well, I don't think Jim Fisher is insincere.
you know,
I think he excuse me one second, Ronelle. I
yeah.
have to get this.
Okay, I will.
Sweetie? Excellent.
Now it's, go ahead. Go ahead, Kurt. What were
So
you saying? That it was entirely, oh, you were saying that Jim Fisher is not insincere, but
no, I don't believe I've met Jim Fisher and I believe he's completely sincere.
mhm,
When I met him, I did manage to ask him. I did manage to ask him why Hauptmann would take a job as a carpenter at the Majestic Apartments in the middle of March if he was carrying on this ransom negotiation and about to receive $50,000. Seemed like a pretty good question.
it is.
And Professor Fisher did not have an answer for me.
No, well, he doesn't have an answer in his book about that either.
No.
But I'm just saying that I brought up his name only because he's the diehard fundamentalist author of this case who doesn't budge on a single issue, nothing. And even he, if we're, I would imagine, would, if you asked him this question, he would have to admit Hauptmann had a personality and it was not in keeping with anything in these notes. But then I guess he would say, well, that's a disguise. That was the excuse all of the handwriting analysts, as you're going to tell us soon, I think, all of them for the state, 7 or 8 of them, they said,
There's
well,
this whole
it's a,
aspect. There's this whole aspect to the research on the case. Those who subscribe to the conventional wisdom that Hauptmann was the kidnapper and killer uh, take a tautological point of view where everything sort of explains itself and doesn't need any further justification. And once you get into it, it's a little bit hard to swallow, I'm afraid to say.
yeah, as you're showing, this makes no sense. Okay, should I turn the page?
Sure.
You, there, hypothesis.
And my hypothesis, and which everything has been leading up to, is that the 15 ransom notes anticipate the incriminating testimony of the handwriting experts at Hauptmann's trial. The whole point of having all these notes is to furnish material for the handwriting experts to incriminate Hauptmann at the trial, which is the objective of the entire affair.
Well, it's a theory. I don't agree with that theory because I don't believe Hauptmann was chosen before the child went missing.
Right.
My theory deals with him falling into a trap that was not of anybody's purposeful making, that he was unknown and happened to have money that got him entangled. So I do, this is, you know, not something I agree with, but it's your theory and everybody's got a theory and who knows what the truth is. So uh, you're saying that he, and there are other people like you who believe Hauptmann was chosen before as part of the ploy, the scam. So Osborne, oh, I think you did this in the part 2, the letters, what, this is Osborne, go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to go back to Albert S. Osborne's report that he made to J. Edgar Hoover in May of 1932 when he got the first look at the full set of ransom notes. And Osborne's reaction to them was that the notes after the first ransom note and after the first 4 lines of the second ransom note, the writing is undisguised. And what Osborne means is that the writing is freely written and fluently written,
Right.
just as if the kidnapper was sitting at his kitchen table and writing in a completely relaxed way. And he expresses this using the language. The letters beginning with number 2 show but little, if any, disguise, although some of them are written more rapidly and carelessly than others. So this is the expert now.
Mm. Yeah.
And he's
then,
looking at undisguised writing.
but then he goes to Flemington.
When Osborne testifies at Hauptmann's trial, and he is asked to describe the notes, he does an about face, and he calls the notes disguised writing. He says, in my opinion, these request writings, I mean, these ransom notes, are disguised writings. Part of the request writings are disguised writings, and the writer didn't have but one disguise. So that when the request writings were asked for, part of them are written in the style of the ransom notes, and part of the request writings are like the writings of the automobile registrations and the promissory note contract. So he comes right out and he says that when Hauptmann gave his samples to the police, he wrote in 2 different styles of writing, one of which resembled the writing that they found in his apartment, and another one that resembled the style in the ransom notes. But Osborne says that style in the ransom notes was disguised. And he says that in contradiction to what he said to J. Edgar Hoover in May of 1932.
Yeah.
So we have 2 types of undisguised writings, one of which resembles Hauptmann's writing in his apartment, and the other of which resembles the ransom notes.
So, Kurt, you've done a lot of research on this, and I haven't, but I do know that handwriting analysis is not considered evident. It's not a science, exactly. And one of the reasons has to, well, if they ever made it a science, they wouldn't be able to manipulate the way they do in courtrooms all over this country, where when David Wilentz wanted to prove that Hauptmann wrote everything, he hired handwriting experts who would not have had jobs in the Depression if they didn't side with David Wilentz's viewpoint. Can you imagine the prosecutor getting somebody as an expert witness who disagrees with the prosecution?
I think you're getting a little ahead of the argument, Ronelle.
Okay, I'll shut up. What's the next?
That's okay. That's okay.
Yeah, I don't
my point is that Osborne's reaction originally was that the ransom notes were undisguised writing.
So why did he change his mind?
So why does he change his mind?
We know the answer. What?
He changes his mind. He changes his mind because he sees in the samples that he is given, he sees that there are 2 kinds of undisguised writing, and he has to say that one of them is a disguise.
So you're not saying he's just switching sides because he needs a job? Because he needs.
I'll get to that.
Okay.
I'll get to that. Yes, I think there's a question of motivation here and compensation, but I don't want to blunt the argument that I'm trying to make before we get there.
Oh, okay. All right. Go ahead.
So Osborne described this bimodal writing because the request writings represented to him as Hauptmann's had one part whose style matched the ransom notes and another part whose style matched the conceded writings, that is, the promissory note and the license application that were obtained from Hauptmann's apartment. If he hadn't been trying to satisfy the prosecution, he would have opined that there were two writers represented in this sample.
Mhm.
The whole point of the sample was that it was supposed to be a single writer, Hauptmann.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, they didn't want there to be a gang, so he had to do everything. He had to be stupid, smart, and otherwise all by himself to close out this case, obviously. So whatever motive Osborne had for doing this about face, we can't know, right? We don't know if it was to preserve his integrity, because he was the handwriting analyst of the time. His book.
He was confronted with samples of writing that were of two different types, but he was told that it was all Hauptmann's writing. So he was forced to say that one part of it was a disguise.
Mhm.
And that was in contradiction to what he said in May 1932 about the kidnapper's writing,
Right,
namely that it
because
wasn't disguised.
it didn't match, and he had to make a reason for why it looked that way. So he said it was a disguise.
Right.
That's what you're saying. Yeah,
So if that makes sense, let's
yeah,
go on.
yeah. Am I on the right page, Kurt?
Yes,
Yeah. Osborne did that because. Oh, so you want me to go to the next? If he hadn't
sure.
been, yeah, contradicted himself when he changed his opinion. Otherwise, he'd have received no fee. Bingo. There you go. When rendering their opinions, whether Hauptmann wrote the ransom notes, each of the experts was careful not to make any representation that Hauptmann wrote all the requests and conceded writings himself. So what do you mean? They didn't make any
What I
representation?
am claiming, Ronelle, is that each of the 8 handwriting experts, and probably the other 4 who were the rebuttal witnesses, was faced with the same situation. They looked at the samples that they were given, that they were told had been written by Hauptmann, and they could see that there were two types of undisguised writing in them. One that resembled the promissory note from Hauptmann's apartment, and the others that resembled the ransom notes.
Mhm.
But they
Okay.
were told that they were all Hauptmann's writing.
Yeah, they were
So,
told before they delivered their opinion. They were
so they had
told.
a problem. They had a problem in delivering their opinions.
They sure did, because they were told what the answer was before they.
Well, they came up with a way to satisfy the prosecution without making any kind of claim that Hauptmann had written all of the writings that were in the ransom in the request writings.
I've been reading the transcript. It's available for those of you who are listening, by the way. The trial transcript is available on Kindle for very little money, I think $3 each volume. And you can search it and read it on your cell phone. It's wonderful. Go to archive.org. Oh, wait a minute. I'm confused. I think I bought mine on Kindle, but it's free on archive.org. You can read the trial transcript, all 3 volumes, and search for words in it. And what I'm trying to say is that I've read some of the handwriting analysts, and I thought I remember them saying Hauptmann. They mention his name and they say Hauptmann wrote them. No, I'm wrong about that.
I have, if you'll go on to the next slide, I'll show you exactly how each of the experts expressed their ultimate opinions
Oh,
on,
okay.
on the writing.
Here's Osborne.
This is Osborne himself. He said, Wallensa asks him, based on your examination and comparison, what is the opinion you have reached? And Osborne says, my opinion is that the ransom notes were all written by the writer of the various papers signed Richard Hauptmann. He doesn't say
Right.
by Richard Hauptmann, He says, by the writer of the papers signed Richard Hauptmann. So in other words, if there were two types of undisguised writing in the request writings, and the writings were signed Richard Hauptmann, that's enough to satisfy Albert S. Osborne that he's looking at Hauptmann's writing. So this is a trick.
Well,
Osborne Sr. is making no representations that the request writings were exclusively written by the defendant.
why don't you explain the difference between these descriptions? Request, there may be some people who are confused.
Yes, request writings were the samples that Hauptmann was asked to make by the police after his arrest. He was given paragraphs of material to copy into his own hand, and those are the request writings.
And the other, what's the other word used?
The conceded writings. The conceded writings are the writings that were found in Hauptmann's apartment, and there's not very much of them.
Why do they use the word conceded? Because he allowed them to take that? What the word concede?
They were conceded. The Hauptmann conceded that they were his writing.
Oh, he conceded. He agreed that they were his own handwriting.
Yes.
Not that he conceded to them taking it. Okay, I get. All right, so that clears that up. Next, and this we should explain. This is the father, Osborne. There's a son with the letter D, I think, in his name.
This is the same Osborne who said that the ransom notes weren't disguised.
Right, and he's the master of handwriting analysis in our country.
Right.
People should understand he wrote the book on this subject, and he's the ultimate authority, though the others were pretty famous themselves. All of them witnesses for prosecution. Did any of them, well, anyway, never mind. Elbridge Stein, go ahead with him.
Elbridge Stein comes up with a slightly different phrasing for his opinion. He says, quote, my opinion is that the writer who wrote the Bruno Richard Hauptmann writings, that is the request and conceded writings, also wrote the ransom letters.
So you're saying the way they're doing this, they're not committing perjury.
Yes, they're just saying that whoever wrote the Bruno Richard Hauptmann writings wrote the ransom letters. Right. They're not saying that Hauptmann wrote them. They're just saying whoever wrote the Bruno Richard Hauptmann writings, using Bruno Richard Hauptmann writings as a label. He doesn't, and not as any affirmation that he actually wrote them.
Right. I see what you're getting at here. Okay, Terrell.
Terrell says something similar. He is asked whether the writers are identical, that they were the writers of the sample are identical, that they were all written by one writer. And they say, and Wilentz says, so that the person who wrote the conceded writings of Bruno Richard Hauptmann and the genuine writings, in your opinion, wrote the ransom notes. He says who wrote the conceded writings of Bruno Richard Hauptmann and the genuine writings, in your opinion, wrote the ransom notes. He decouples person from Bruno Richard Hauptmann. He's saying whoever wrote the writings wrote the ransom notes, but I'm not going to say that was Hauptmann himself, because he can see that Hauptmann couldn't have done it.
I never heard of Herbert J. Walter. Who was he?
Another handwriting expert.
Never heard of this guy. And he does the same thing.
He says, in my opinion, the same person who wrote the request writings and conceded writings, those signed Richard Hauptmann, is the same person who wrote all of the ransom notes.
You know what's very...
He doesn't say that that's Hauptmann. He just says that the writings signed Richard Hauptmann are written by the person who wrote all the ransom notes. So he opens the door to a fraud.
Cassidy, I've heard of.
Yes.
Um, the same Kurt, what's becoming a little obvious to me, these statements are identical, and that's very suspicious. Whenever you get identical statements from witnesses, there's something not kosher in Denmark.
Well, don't forget that handwriting analysis is supposed to be a science. And if the experts don't agree on their opinions, then it wouldn't be a science.
I know,
And
but
if it's not a science, they have nothing to sell.
but you could take these answers and move them around from one to the other. They're identical. It's like they were all in a room and decided what they're going to say. You know what I mean?
Well, these witnesses were all prepared
Right.
by the prosecution, rehearsed by the prosecution, that is, and they're all giving their opinions in the way that the prosecution has expected all along.
This is very disturbing. Very disturbing. I didn't, I haven't read the trial transcript is 3 volumes and thousands of pages, and I haven't got the stamina to read through how you got through this. I don't know. And it's just now you're making it obvious to me that they were all in a room and somebody told them what to say. Obviously, this is identical from one to the other. You want to
What
say
they
more?
are doing, Ronelle, is finding a way. They are finding a way to incriminate Hauptmann without giving away their original reaction to seeing these writings, the sample writings. Their original reaction was that there were two people writing the sample writings, and that's exactly what they don't want to say in court.
Right.
So that's why they say the same person who wrote those request writings and those standard or conceded writings, I believe you called them in the courtroom, is the same person who wrote all those ransom notes. The same person. And then the prosecution asks if Bruno Richard Hauptmann wrote the request writings and the genuine writings, your opinion of the writer of the ransom notes is whom? And he says, if Mr. Hauptmann wrote those sample writings, I feel compelled to say that he wrote those ransom notes. But he's not going to say that Hauptmann, he's not going to testify that Hauptmann did write the samples.
No, because nobody was there when the thing was written. No, oh, Suter. Okay, well, I know about this guy. Everybody talked about him a lot on the forum that I had. Okay, he does the same thing. Oh no, his answer is a little bit different.
He says, it is my opinion these three sets of documents were written by the same individual. That is, the request writings, the conceded writings, and the ransom notes were all written by the same individual. But he doesn't say that's Hauptmann. And then he is asked by the prosecution, taking into consideration the genuine writing of Hauptmann and the request writings, if they were written by Mr. Hauptmann, what have you to say as to the author of the ransom notes? And Suter says, if Mr. Hauptmann wrote the request writings and the admitted writings, he also wrote the ransom documents.
Mm-hmm.
What good is that as far as court testimony? Because Hauptmann is supposed to have written the samples, but each of the experts is not going to testify to that.
Right.
They say if Mr. Hauptmann wrote the request writings and the admitted writings, he also wrote the ransom documents. So they turn it into a conditional statement.
Well, they're protecting their business. They wouldn't be in the business they're in.
Well, they want to get paid.
Right.
They want to get paid. They want to satisfy the prosecution, but they don't want to perjure themselves.
Right.
And that's why they express it as a conditional statement.
Right.
If Mr. Hauptmann wrote the request writings, they're making no representation that he really did.
No.
write the request
But
writings.
do you think the jury understood that? Of course they did
No,
not. The jury
no.
only heard what they want.
I think the jury accepted this form of expressing their opinion as a formality that that was typical for this kind of testimony.
Here's Osborne's son, Albert D.
Yeah, he comes the closest to giving it away, I think. His opinion says, in my judgment, the writer of these standard and other writings, Bruno Richard Hauptmann, wrote all the ransom notes. He is actually saying that Hauptmann wrote the conceded and uh, request writings.
Yeah.
But the prosecution catches him, and the prosecution says, so that if Bruno Richard Hauptmann wrote the genuine writings and the request writings, what have you to say as to the identity of the author of the ransom notes? And this says that's a conditional statement again, and then Osborne says, I believe he wrote all the ransom notes in that case. So Osborne, in the previous statement above, he slips. He says, in my judgment, the writer of these standard and other writings, Bruno Richard Hauptmann, wrote all the ransom notes. He is slipping and exposing himself to a perjury accusation.
They're protecting him from that.
He's not covering himself the way he was probably prepared by the prosecution to do.
And here's Clark Sellers, another famous name in the.
This is the best one, in my opinion. He's asked, what is the opinion, sir, that you have arrived at? Please state it. And Sellers says, I am convinced absolutely that the person who wrote these writings, the conceded writings and the request writings in this case, which have been submitted to me as being the genuine writings of Bruno Richard Hauptmann, is the same writer who wrote each one of these ransom notes and who addressed the envelopes in which they were sent and who addressed the wrapper in which the sleeping suit was returned. That is to say, if Mr. Bruno Richard Hauptmann wrote these conceded and request writings, then he wrote these ransom notes. Sellers is going out of his way to cover himself that he makes no representation that Hauptmann wrote the conceded and request writings.
Blaming it on the
writings were submitted to him as being writings of Hauptmann.
And
but he doesn't make any representation of his own that they are Hauptmann's writing. Do you see that?
Yeah, I noticed it right away. He's saying the cops gave me these things and they told me he wrote them.
They told me that Hauptmann wrote them, and if he did write them, then he wrote the ransom notes.
Right. Yeah, he's blaming it on, he's putting the
onus on the cops.
Right. Because they gave them to me and they told me he wrote them, and therefore he wrote the ransom notes because they match. Yep. Based on
the odd manner in which the experts worded their conclusions, it should be clear that each of them had been suspicious of the sample writings the police had given them to analyze. That's why they say if the sample came from Hauptmann, then he was guilty.
But they didn't trust the cops, right? They didn't trust the cops to give them.
Well, they didn't want to be exposed. They didn't want to be exposed to committing perjury.
Right.
So they made no representation that they themselves knew that Hauptmann had written the samples.
Okay, so this is Osborne.
This is Osborne going a little deeper into his thinking. He says in the transcript, we have a large number of pages of what is known or described as request writing. That is, a writing that the writer was asked to write, knowing inevitably, of course, that the purpose of it was to examine his handwriting and to see what kind of handwriting he did write. You will find when you examine these papers, if you have not already examined them, that some of this request writing is of matter that is written 3 times, the same matter. Now, that was a request made at the suggestion of writers on the subject that in asking for request writing, it is desirable to have the same matter written more than once, not merely to get more writing, but to see whether it is the genuine, ordinary, habitual writing of the writer. Now, next page. That is shown in this way. When, for instance, a page of writing, as some of these letters are, a whole page, when it is dictated to a writer and the writing is then taken away, the sheet is taken away from the writer and another sheet is supplied and the same matter is dictated. Now, if they differ from each other, it is not the habitual, genuine, honest writing of the writer. And that is exactly what we find in this request writing. In one instance, we find it on the same sheet of paper. In other words, he's saying there are two different kinds of writing in the request writing samples. He says, in my opinion, these request writings, I mean, these ransom notes, are disguised writings.
Now
Part
he's
of the request writings are disguised writings, and the writer didn't have but one disguise. Here he is contradicting what he told J. Edgar Hoover in May of 1932. So that when the request writings were asked for, next page, part of them are written in the style of the ransom notes, and part of the request writings are like the writings of the automobile registrations and the promissory note contract. Now, in my opinion, that has significance in this case as indicating the condition of mind of the writer in writing, for instance, Exhibit S72. Exhibit S72 has 5 lines of writing on it, very similar to the ransom notes, and then there is a sudden change to the natural or more natural style of this writer. In other words, there are 2 different kinds of writing in 72, writing that's similar to the ransom notes, which is disguised, and then a transition to natural or fluent style of writing of this writer. So he's saying that the disguised handwriting is not fluent or natural, but the other writing is. Then he says on exhibit S7, on exhibit number 73, we have the writing. All of the writing is like the last part of 72. It is not the disguised writing at all. And this particular exhibit, in my opinion, exhibit 73, would hardly furnish basis for the opinion that that writer wrote the ransom notes. I mean, if that is the only one we had. Now, exhibit number 74 is nearly all of it like the first part of 72. It is all in that unnatural style, the whole sheet. In other words, all like the ransom notes. Number 75 is another one that is not disguised. It resembles the conceded writings of the promissory note and the license that were found in Hauptmann's apartment. In examining these request writings, it is necessary to examine them in comparison with each other to see which of the writings can be depended upon as a basis of comparison for the identification of the ransom notes. This is how he describes the sample that he was given. 2 different kinds of writing, one that resembles the ransom notes and another that resembles the conceded writing.
so
Each expert had been confronted with sample writings comprising 2 distinct styles, an undisguised style from Hauptmann's promissory note and a wholly different but obviously undisguised sample which the police pretended Hauptmann had written. The experts each knew that this was extremely unlikely, but they deliberately distorted their opinions as rendered in their testimony at Flemington to conceal the fact that 2 persons had written the request and conceded writings. So they all knew that there's two different people had written the samples that they were given to analyze. But they said if one person wrote them all, then that person wrote the ransom notes.
So the methods used.
What do we know about the circumstances of Hauptmann's writing the request writing? And we know that they were written under the supervision of New York Police Department Lieutenant James J. Finn. Here we have Finn on the left and the unfortunate Hauptmann on the right. And Finn is bringing him in to be shown to the press.
The Frog March. That's what they call it, the Frog March.
Now, Lieutenant Finn testified at Flemington, but he also wrote a memoir called How I Captured Hauptmann that was in Liberty magazine. And
let me interrupt just 1 second. I believe that these articles, if they're not available on my website, you could find them at archive.org. There's no fee. It's all free. Archive.org. People, if they're interested in researching everything that you're talking about, if they go to archive.org and do a search, put a search in for How I Captured Hauptmann or the name Lieutenant James J. Finn, they may be able, I think this is available somewhere on the internet for free, because Liberty magazine, as you said, this was a memoir that it was not a book. He never wrote a book, but it was published in Liberty magazine. Go ahead.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm quoting from Lieutenant Finn's memoir called How I Captured Hauptmann. And Finn says, when it came to the handwriting tests, we had special reason for treating Hauptmann well. We wanted him to write as he would have written if he had been at home. We did everything we could to make him feel that he was among friends. The desk at which he sat was no inquisitorial table. It was an ordinary sized flat-top desk. The chair was an ordinary straight-backed one. He was quite willing to write, even eager to, and as we dictated our test paragraphs to him, it was obvious that he was making a conscious effort to disguise his handwriting.
This guy Finn,
This was to be expected, says Finn, and it wasn't so important as it may seem, for no attempted disguise could affect his characteristic spellings or conceal the basic peculiarities in the formation of the individual letters. The bad feature of this labored writing was that it produced a stiff specimen rather than a natural one. The stiff writing had its points, however. There was a good deal of it in the ransom notes. The extortioner had written easily so long as he was on sure ground. Then, when he came to something like comments on the health and diet of the baby, he had involuntarily stiffened up. Now, Finn is no handwriting expert himself, so all of this has to be taken with a grain of salt. Next slide.
You should also mention that Detective Finn was Lindbergh's personal friend.
That's true. We'll get to that.
Yeah.
We were getting plenty of specimens of stiff writing, but none of the easy writing which characterized most of the ransom notes and all of the admitted writings we had found. Something had to be done about it. We tried giving our man long rests and engaging him in conversation on idle topics. The papers said we kept him writing all night. These are the facts. In all, he covered 16 pages between, say, 9 in the evening and 1:30 that night, but the actual writing took only an hour and a half. We gave him, you see, plenty of time for rest and diversion, but it didn't accomplish our immediate purpose. The writings remained stiff. So in other words, he's saying that Hauptmann wrote in a disguised hand, and he's not producing writing like the ransom notes. Remember that Osborne had said that the writing that resembled the ransom notes was Hauptmann's disguise. So it's in complete. The two opinions are in complete contradiction to one another.
Well, anybody
Finn
want to
goes
buy?
on.
Yeah.
Finn goes on. Back up.
Back up? Oh, I thought you did that already.
No, go ahead. Next slide. Then Corporal Horn and I tried a simple expedient. Back of Hauptmann were my desk and one used by one of my assistants. On both desks were telephones. I told a couple of the boys to sit at these desks and pretend to call up their friends and converse with them. Hauptmann couldn't see the telephoners, but of course he couldn't help listening to them with one ear while he was taking the dictation with the other. Can you believe this? The boys put on a good act. They called up their girls, or pretended to, and had some pretty fancy conversation with them. It made good listening, and it certainly had a magical effect on Hauptmann. Standing behind him, I could see that he was writing as easily and fluently as if he were at home.
Anybody
Next.
want to buy a bridge in Brooklyn? I got one for sale.
Well, you see what's going on here. He's saying they took special steps to get Hauptmann to write freely and fluently.
Yeah,
In
they
other
beat
words,
him
to
up with a
relax.
yeah, they beat him up with a hammer and didn't let him sleep for 2 days.
That's another issue. That's another issue.
I think it's important about how you're going to write. If somebody beat me up with a hammer and didn't let me go to sleep, I don't
He
think
was he was beaten before this, Ronelle.
yeah, but
Beating him was one of the first things they did.
right, right. But how you're going to write anything that you wouldn't be able to read your own handwriting after that experience? Am I on the right page or am I just
Next page.
next? Okay.
And Finn says, finally, at last I had what I wanted. I had seen with my own eyes the man who passed the ransom money write the identical words in the identical way that the man who had been in the nursery of Colonel Lindbergh's child had written them in the ransom note he left on the windowsill. I gave the sign to the boys at the desk to cut out their clowning and bring me a cot. Don't forget, the ransom note left on the windowsill was completely uneven. It was an unrecognizable handwriting style.
Right.
But Finn is saying here that Hauptmann, once he relaxed, wrote in that style. And he says, I gave the sign to the boys at the desk to cut out their clowning and bring me a cot. Here, I said to Hauptmann, you've done your job. Lie down and get some sleep. So this is Finn's account of how he got Hauptmann to write in the style of the ransom notes. He had to get him relaxed. And this contradicts the notion that Hauptmann wrote in a disguised hand in order to produce the writing in the ransom notes.
Right.
So between Osborne and Finn, they are all over the place.
Yeah.
They're all over the place. One says that the writing that Hauptmann produced that resembled the ransom notes was disguised writing. That is, was carefully drawn and laboriously drawn and faked. And Finn says the writing which resembled the ransom notes only was produced once they had managed to get Hauptmann relaxed and writing freely. So there is enough falsehood in this material, just what we have in front of us, to show that the handwriting evidence is completely suspect.
Right. As the people who were asked to give their opinions about it.
I believe that each of the handwriting experts knew the sample that they had been given contained two different types of undisguised writing, and that they couldn't have been written by the same person. But they expressed their opinions by saying, if that writing sample had been written by all been written by the same person, then that person had to be the one who wrote the ransom notes. But they themselves made no representation that Hauptmann wrote the sample. They just tricked the court into believing it.
So how did they sleep at night for the rest of their lives? This is like a business. It's a vulture. It's disgusting. I mean, you would expect from people who claim to be scientists. There's no science about it. I don't know. I don't investigate handwriting.
I think they did it. I think in their defense, one could say that once they were told that the ransom money had been found in Hauptmann's garage, they were all willing to believe that Hauptmann was guilty, and that's why they put their thumbs on the scale themselves in this highly suspect manner with their court testimony.
Exactly. I agree 100%. The minute they heard that there was 14,000 in the garage, it clinched it for them. regardless of what they saw with their own eyes, uh, they now went along with the prosecution because they believed he was guilty. And what's another
Right, so
nail in that?
they basically usurped the function of the court
Yeah.
and uh,
The function of the court is the search for truth, but not in, it's an adversarial system that we have. It's them against us, the prosecution against the defense, and who's got the most money. Well, we know all this. Go ahead
now,
with
if
the,
there had been somebody, if there had been somebody with enough shrewdness among the defense, they could have blown up this. They could have blown up this testimony, all of it, by confronting each of the handwriting experts over the fact that they refused to say that Hauptmann wrote the sample.
so the defense was,
So what I would have said was, if I had been on the defense, I would have said, uh, "Did do you know for a fact that Hauptmann wrote the entire sample?"
they couldn't have said that. They couldn't have
They
said
couldn't,
that.
and they would have said, "Well, no, I was the writings were submitted to me as his writing. Thank you." It
Uh,
would have been very simple. I would have done that for each of the 8 handwriting experts.
so much of that trial could have been simple and oh well, we could talk about this forever. What's next on oh, we're up to page 73. We went through the whole thing.
Well, I think we're
Some,
through the whole thing. We can take
yeah,
some questions, Ramel.
questions from who? We're
From
recording.
you. If you have any
From me?
questions, we can try to answer them.
You want to answer my questions? I got plenty of questions for
Sure,
you, but it's
sure.
all over the place. I don't know what to ask you. What did Anna Hauptmann tell you about the, did she mention these notes, the handwriting at all? Because
She
I
didn't
know
mention the hand. We didn't talk about the handwriting testimony.
somewhere in the books or in Liberty magazine, Hauptmann was quoted as saying that handwriting killed me, or some, you know what I'm,
That handwriting was the worstest thing of all,
yeah, he said that. I don't remember who he said that to. Do you remember?
and he was right.
Yeah. Yeah, it wasn't the latter that Willents, David Willents, the prosecutor, vowed from the before the trial started to wrap the ladder around Hauptmann's neck. In other words, he was going to prove that Hauptmann built that ladder, but it was actually the handwriting probably that did it, right? Hauptmann thought so anyway.
They were both very bad, but the handwriting testimony, I think, was even worse than the latter.
Why do you think so? The ladder, I mean, they said he went up into his attic and took out a piece of wood from the floor.
I think that the dereliction of Riley was at its worst, in the handwriting evidence.
Oh,
But it was also very bad in the case of the latter, because he never asked Kaler whether rail 16 could have been removed from the attic by someone other than Hauptmann.
yeah, they never asked that at the trial at all. Riley should have asked him. So you say,
I would have said to Kaler, do you believe that that Hauptmann was the one who removed rail 16 from the attic? And Kaler would have said, of course.
how could he have known?
And then I would have said, why? Why is that? Couldn't somebody else have gone up into that attic and removed rail 16?
Yeah, but
Say,
nobody asked. Riley was useless, um, useless. But Hauptmann did believe that the handwriting is what drove the nail into his death
right,
penalty.
right.
I don't believe actually that the jurors, considering there were, how many did you go through? 8 of them, 7 or 8 handwriting analysts. Could you imagine being on a jury where they had to talk about this every day for day after day, and then the ladder with all the scientists, I think they just fell asleep. And when they heard Lindbergh say he did it, okay, he did it. And they had their answer before any of these testimonies came on the.
It's hard to
It's hard
second
to
guess
say,
what the jurors thought, Ronelle.
right? But who could sit through all of that? You know, if the people listening to us right now may not even know what kind of charts they brought with the letter C from this letter and the letter whatever. They broke down the letters, they broke down the handwriting. It's mind-boggling stuff that could put anybody in the electric chair if you know how to do it. And the prosecution surely knew what they were doing. They did, and the defense had no clue other than Jim. What was his name? Fisher. So what
Lloyd
question?
Fisher.
The New Jersey lawyer who was
Lloyd Fisher.
Lloyd Fisher. But most people point to the inadequacies of the defense counsel. The defense, the main complaint that you hear a lot of the time about Riley is that he never questioned the identity of the dead child in the woods, which he could. I believe it actually was the child. Most people do believe it was Lindbergh's son. That was.
I don't think it would have helped him with the jury to question that.
No, but it would have put. But wouldn't that? But by agreeing to everything, Riley. No. Why wouldn't?
Well, I would have, for example, Ronelle, I would have, if I had been Riley, I would have conceded the prosecution's assertion that rail 16 came out of the attic. And I would have said, instead of trying to bring the witnesses like Mielke and so forth to
debunk
Flemington,
yeah,
I would have conceded the testimony that rail 16 came out of the attic, but I would have claimed that Hauptmann did not remove it. The people that removed it were the ones who were bent on framing Hauptmann for this crime. Right. And I would have taken the approach that I've taken in this video to describe how tormented the handwriting testimony had to be and how twisted it had to be in order to incriminate Hauptmann.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Now, there was a part in the trial transcript, I don't remember where it is, but Hauptmann, in his own defense, said that when he went to the beach, what's the name of that island? Blackwell's Island, where they all hung out, a lot of German immigrants. Hunter's Island, that he had gone swimming and he left his clothing and a book. He had a book in his pocket, pants pocket. He had writings, he had correspondence, and it was stolen. Do you remember that part? That part of his testimony? And I thought
I don't actually.
Yeah, he claimed, and it was never brought up again. But I believe that by him going into that kind of detail about having lost his possessions by going swimming, someone stole. I don't remember if they stole his clothing, but they stole the correspondence was missing, and he never got it back.
Very interesting that you mentioned that, Ronelle, because
yeah,
there was a rumor in Hauptmann's neighborhood there in the Bronx that the handwriting that was obtained from Hauptmann's apartment was done with the cooperation of his landlord, and the same was true of rail 16. They both believe. Are we done here?
No, just with you. I stopped sharing the screen. We're not done. No.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
You want me to put it back on?
There was a rumor in the neighborhood. There was a rumor in the neighborhood that Hauptmann's landlord had allowed the Hauptmann's framers to get up into his apartment and grab samples of his handwriting. And that was also true of rail 16. that the landlord had been responsible for letting people up into the attic in Hauptmann's apartment to get real 16 out.
Yeah.
And this rumor circulated in the neighborhood until the man who ran the beer garden that was right near Hauptmann's house was murdered in 1937. And he was shot, and the medical examiner said it was a suicide. But the people in the neighborhood believed that he had been shot in order to cow the neighborhood into quelling the rumors that that Hauptmann's landlord had been responsible for setting him up.
Well, any number of things could have happened. We will never know the answer. I don't know. Everybody's got another theory about how Hauptmann got entangled in all of this. And it was like,
Well, it's quite simple. It's quite simple, isn't it?
no, it's not simple. What's simple about any of this?
When
What do you mean?
Hauptmann was arrested, on the 19th of September, that was a Wednesday. And a few days later, on Saturday, my father and my cousin and my grandfather were at Hans's Bavarian beer garden, right near Hauptmann's apartment. And a newsman came up to them and said, "Is it true that Hauptmann is a Nazi?"
Mhm.
And my grandfather said, "Of course not. Who told you that?" And the reporter said it was Hauptmann's landlord, Max Rauch, who called Hauptmann a Nazi. And apparently my grandfather went over sometime after this and confronted Rauch about the fact that he had called Hauptmann a Nazi.
And did Rauch say he did? He
I
did
don't
not?
know what Rauch's answer was.
Uh-huh.
My cousin did not remember.
You know, when somebody is arrested, before they've had a trial, before they've been investigated, everybody who knew that person suddenly starts thinking, oh, yeah, he said this and he did that. And this was shady and this was stealthy and and this is what happens to us human beings. We want to apply meaning to every little thing to make sense out of this stupid world we live in. And I just think there was a lot of hate mongering. And of course, anytime a neighborhood has something like this happen, somebody that everybody knows is in the front page of the news as a baby killer of I mean, think of all the people who were. So I don't put much faith in what the Rauchs, of course, what you say, the Rauchs were Jews and Hauptmann was not Jewish. So they would have thought every German in their neighborhood was now a Hitlerite. Who knows? Who knows? I don't ever believe that. Who knows? I mean, we don't know what.
Rauch's mother was interviewed by Congressman Dick Stein
Oh, yeah?
about meetings that the Hauptmanns had in their apartment that included members of the organization, the pro-Nazi organization, the Friends of the New Germany. And you've seen that before, I'm sure.
No, I didn't know she was interviewed by Dick Stein. No, I didn't know.
Yeah.
Dick Stein was the McCormick.
I'll send you the clipping.
Okay.
I'll send you the clipping, Ronelle.
Yeah, I didn't know. What did he was a congressman from where? I know, of course, the Dick Stein McCormick committee
That's
became.
the same man.
I know, but what state was he from? New York? I don't remember.
Yeah, from New York. One of
But
the boroughs of I think he was from Brooklyn.
I thought so. I think he was a Brooklyn congressman, but why would he be investigating the Bronx? Well, whatever.
Be investigating the Friends of the New Germany.
Oh, right. Oh, of course. They were in the McCormick Dick Stein committee were investigating.
So he made this connection with Hauptmann's landlady, and they tried to paint Hauptmann as a pro-Nazi.
So in the Dick Stein McCormick testimonies, if I went online and found them, you mean Anna Hauptmann is one of the people in there in the transcript?
Yeah, they claimed Dick Stein claimed that that the Hauptmanns had meetings at their apartment that included members of this organization, this pro-Hitler organization.
And he supported that idea. It was supported in the testimony, or it was given by Rauch. You're saying Mrs. Rauch?
I don't think Rauch doesn't say that at Flemington.
No, none of this is at
No,
Flemington.
no.
I would have seen that.
But the New York Daily Mirror, Walter Winchell's newspaper, has it plastered on the front page in one of their issues. Link Nazis to kidnap, it says.
Now he should have known better about that. But that's what I mean. I mean, I'm just saying it's like a virus that happens when, you know, people start attributing things of their imagination to reality when they don't know what they're talking about. Like maybe people think that about us because
Well,
you
I look at it. I look at it. I don't. So I'm starting to stutter.
know.
I look at it. I look at it in a more direct way, Ronelle. That it's possible. It's possible that Hauptmann was framed deliberately by people who were trying to create the illusion of a Nazi fifth column in the United States.
Why not?
Was vicious enough to kidnap the Lindbergh baby and kill him.
But you don't see that in the newspapers because you and I both subscribe to newspapers.com and we both research a lot of the period of the 20s and 30s. You and me both do that. And it's another suggestion I have for people listening to us if they want to spend, how much is it now, Kurt? $100 a year, I think, to subscribe to this wonderful website where you can read thousands of newspapers from, what is it, the 1880s?
It's really remarkable, isn't
it? Yeah. And I laugh about it because I'm more familiar. I read those newspapers from the 1920s and 30s and even the 40s. I'm so familiar with the headlines and the people they're referring to. And I read today's newspapers. I don't understand who anybody is, but I could read a paper from 100 years ago or 70 years ago and know everything that they're talking about. Is that the same experience you have, or you're more familiar with the past than you are with the present?
Absolutely. It's a marvelous. It's like a time machine.
Yeah, it is. It is. You don't have to go to Harvard University history classes to know about history. If you just read all the, well, again, the journalist, you brought up Walter Winchell, another unreliable person, but you know that he was connected to J. Edgar Hoover, right? You knew that Walter Winchell was fed dope by Hoover, who wanted to get even with certain people, and Winchell would put it in his column. And for that exchange, Winchell got inside information from Hoover and vice versa. So the two of them were connected. And Hoover, you should explain to everyone, was not allowed to investigate this case. The government detective agency had to leave Hopewell, was it? What day he threw him out? You remember?
Yeah, I'm not up on the dates that the FBI was
It
active.
was early. It was early in Hoover.
Very early.
Yeah, and Lindbergh wanted no part of him. So anyway, so what else can we say about the handwriting experts? I wanted to mention something I didn't. I'm sorry I interrupted you as many times as I did, but these Osborne the father and son Osborne team, they were complicit in approving. Was it the Hitler diary or the Howard Hughes diary? One of the two. Do you remember when we discussed that years and years
No, I don't.
You forgot about it because we talked about it. I used to have a forum on my website, and every day people would discuss this. Kurt was part of it, and yeah, it was discovered, I think, by Mike Melsky at the time. I forgot who discovered it. And they posted the information that when, see, it wouldn't be the Hitler Diaries because that happened to the German newspaper over there. The Spiegel, was it? It must have been the Howard Hughes, the Time Life people were buying Howard Hughes's diary. This recluse billionaire had a supposed secret diary, and Time Life, Warner Time, I don't know if they were Warner yet, but they were Time Life in Rockefeller Center, and they were purchasing it for upteen millions of dollars. And the Osborne father and son team told them this was the handwriting of Howard Hughes, which everybody knows. As a matter of fact, they made a movie which I purchased just because I wanted to see the Osbornes go down, and they're nowhere in the movie. It's a book. What was it called? You don't know what I'm talking about?
No, I'm afraid I don't.
I'm sorry, I brought this up then. I thought you would have remembered it. Uh, Clark Clifford was his name, the guy that, okay, forget about it, but people can look this up. Albert D. and Albert S. Osborne were the handwriting experts that analyzed Howard Hughes's diary and said, go ahead, Time Life, pay $1 trillion for this stuff. Turned out to be phony. Yep,
Well,
those are the experts.
you don't know what went on behind the scenes, Ronelle.
Do we ever? Do we ever? But we do know one thing. David Wilentz became a very important politician from this trial. And he went on to become powerful, the Pope of Perth Amboy, they called him. And unfortunately, our dear beloved Governor Hoffman ruined his life trying to find proof that Richard was innocent or something to
Well,
the execution.
I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if people close to Harold Hoffman could see all the flaws in the trial, just as we've analyzed one of the significant flaws in this series of presentations.
What do you mean? That people couldn't see it because they were too close
I
to it?
think I don't think there's nothing that we presented that couldn't have been seen back in 1936.
Yeah, that's my point. It was like a gentleman's agreement. People stood away and let it happen. People who had questions and who could see, the flaws in the thinking, the flaws in the theories, the flaws in the trial, they just let it happen. They didn't they didn't protest, they didn't question anything, and they figured, well, he's guilty anyway. What difference does it make? That was that's basically, I think, what was at the bottom of his execution. He's guilty anyway, so let them fib and let them lie and let them,
Upman was such Upman was such a mild-mannered guy. My father used to see him at the Baychester Meadow in that part of the Bronx with his field glasses, watching birds. There were pheasant and a red-winged blackbird that infested the meadow, and Hauptmann used to go there to look at the birds with his binoculars. And he also used to go to Seton Falls Park, which was a famous scenic spot right in the middle of that part of the Bronx.
Now you're from the Bronx, right? So you really know the Bronx well.
Right.
So what part are you talking about? What park is this?
Well, it's gone now. It's gone now. It was ruined. It was destroyed in the late 40s or early 50s. But there was a place where Rattlesnake Creek made its way through the area near Boston Road, and there was a famous waterfall right there that was very scenic.
A waterfall in the Bronx? You got to be kidding me.
No,
Well,
no.
how high could a waterfall be in the Bronx? 10 feet?
Well, it wasn't very high, but that's not the point. It was a beautiful spot.
Oh. The
And
Bronx
I saw this when I was a small boy. My grandmother took me there.
Well, on that point, I agree 100% with Jaffe, with Dr. Condon. It is the most beautiful borough of the five, I think. Do you don't agree with
Oh,
Jaffe?
yeah, but I think in 1932 it was very rustic.
Right. Well, Edgar Allan Poe brought Annabel Lee there she had consumption, and people went to the Bronx to become healthy again. Even Fiorello LaGuardia, I don't know how many people know this, his first wife died of consumption, and he brought her there to for her. It had fresh air, and you went there to convalesce. Did you know that about LaGuardia's wife?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, she had consumption and they lived in the Bronx. And Edgar Allan Poe brought Annabel Lee. Poe House, Poe Cottage is right there on the Grand Concourse, across the street from Rosenhaim's. There's so much we could talk about, but this was supposed to be just about the handwriting. And you're not, well, so I'm not going to ask you who you think wrote the notes, because you're going to write a book about and tell us who you think did that.
I'm working on a book that will include the material from our presentation and more.
I have a different take on all of it. So my Ransom writer is a completely different person, and I know lots of people believe Jaffe wrote them or Lindbergh wrote them. Yeah. What else can we talk about?
I think that's it for this morning, Ronelle. It's
So
been a
you got it.
pleasure.
Yeah, I love doing this, and I'm glad that we're back on the channel again. Uh, if you want to make a PDF, another lecture on what else? The wood. Do you know about the wood? You were there the day I took all those photographs. You've been with Kelvin Correga.
Kelvin is one of the top Lindbergh researchers, if not the top. He's
Really?
so methodical and so careful.
He's a sweetheart. And I
His
asked,
presentation, sorry,
go ahead.
his presentation that he made in 2005 was a watershed in my study of the Lindbergh case.
I've asked him to come and do his thing here. That was a couple of years ago. Maybe I should email him. Kelvin, if you're watching this, you're welcome to come on anytime with your lecture. He did it for us. Remember that, Kurt, in the park, in Van Cortlandt Park, on a beautiful spring day?
Yes,
You were there
yes.
too on Richard Sloan's tour. Yeah. So you think that was the greatest research of the.
I think Kelvin's research on the ladder, where he completely overturned any speculation that the ladder rail 16 could have been tampered with. I
Really?
think that was one of the keys in this whole case.
But Calvin doesn't make the case that it was tampered with. He doesn't make that case. His case is that it's actually Hauptmann who took the wood and did it. I
That's
believe.
fine. That's fine. I don't think he asserts. I don't think he asserts that it had to be Hauptmann who took Rail 16 out of the attic.
Oh, he
Just that
doesn't.
Rail 16 did come out of the attic.
Oh, he's not pointing to Hauptmann having done it.
I can't imagine that he would do that.
Okay, I thought he did, but
I should
I've
check
asked.
with him.
Yeah, and when you check with him, tell him to do a video with me and explain what he discovered in his. But you were there when he was doing it, I think, in the museum, weren't
It
you?
was at Flemington, wasn't it? It was in Flemington at a in the courthouse
Where Kelvin presented that?
when he in 2005 when he presented his research, and then we went across the street. I sat there with Lloyd and Siglenda and Mark, And we marveled at how thorough Kelvin had been
Very,
with all of this. But I
very.
don't think there's anything in his research that really justifies the claim that Hauptmann had to be the one who took Rail 16 out of the attic.
Mhm.
There were never any fingerprints. The fact
No.
that Hauptmann was a carpenter, well, you know, would he really have thought of going up into the attic and taking a piece of wood out of the attic if he needed one? He'd have that would have taken much longer than just driving to the National Lumber and Millwork people and getting a 7-foot piece of wood
Right.
for pennies.
Well, before she died, I had a long conversation with Joyce Milton on the telephone. And I asked her, she was telling me that Hauptmann did it, and Hauptmann made the ladder, and Hauptmann, for those of you who don't know who Joyce Milton is, she wrote a book called, what's it called? Loss of Eden.
Right.
And so she's telling me that Hauptmann did it, and he made the ladder, and the reason it was so shoddy, because I told her he was a craftsman. He was a woodworking. He made a living at this carpentry, and he wouldn't have made anything as ugly and put together like that. And she said, well, he was in a hurry. I said, why was he in a hurry? She said, because he got the message, he got the phone call that it had to happen the next night, and he had not finished the ladder yet, and he needed an
Really?
extra. This is her. This is.
Did she say where he got the phone call?
Wait,
He didn't
wait,
have a phone
wait,
in his
wait.
house.
Ah, yeah. So I said to her, he couldn't have made such a shoddy ladder. And she said he was in a hurry because he got the phone call that it was going to happen the next night, and he wasn't prepared. So he went up in the attic and pulled out the lumber. And I said, well, just what you just I said, well, where did he get the message? She told me they called him at the last minute. I said, how? On the telephone. I said, but don't you know he didn't have a telephone in his house? And there was this dead silence on the other end of the phone. And then she said, well, they got the message to him somehow or other. Now, even Joyce Milton, we can't know everything when we research, but she didn't know the fact that he had no phone. And how were they going to, just what
The
you
most
asked?
difficult thing to do, Ronelle, is to make a global theory of the case, a theory that explains everything.
Exactly.
People love to look at the individual pieces of evidence and the individual incidents in the case and immerse themselves in the details. But making a global theory that works from the top down is very, very hard. And there are some excellent researchers that will not even try to this day.
Because it's a thankless task. Every time you put something together, someone else comes along and says, no, you're wrong. And nothing fits together. This is a puzzle that's never going to be completed. It can't be. It's too old by now. And as long, okay, so we could end it by saying, maybe this will be my last word for now, that as long as New Jersey refuses to do forensic testing, either on the envelopes that are in the safe, as you and I have seen them and handled them in the safe over there, Trenton, New Jersey. There are how many envelopes? A dozen envelopes with somebody licked and put a stamp on. As long as New Jersey stonewalls the testing of those flaps, and let's remember the wood is a living plant, was once alive, and it's got DNA in it. So between the ladder and the envelopes, as long as New Jersey keeps stonewalling everyone, there can't be any. What do you think?
I think DNA testing for the ransom notes and the envelopes would be helpful, but I think it's more significant that there are no fingerprints on the ransom notes. Here is this kidnapper that's supposed to be so careless and can't keep his mouth shut through 15 ransom notes, and yet he's shrewd enough to keep from leaving any fingerprints on any of these ransom notes. I didn't mention that in my presentation, but I probably should have.
Well, he had gloves. That's why his handwriting was so awful. How can you write anything with gloves on? Maybe that's the reason. Who
There are no
knows?
fingerprints anywhere in the case.
Well, they washed off the ladder. The police were told, I forgot at what point, I just read about it. There was a point at which the police were told to take a hose and wash down the ladder. Whose book is that in? I don't remember. You know what I'm talking about? They
Sure.
washed down the ladder.
Uh,
Oh, well. Kurt, I love you. It's been
Love you too, Ronelle.
25 years or so that we know each other, and maybe we'll do this again if you come up with some good ideas. Write a book, and hopefully I'll finish mine.
Great.
All
Great.
right. Take
Okay, I'll catch up with you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.